Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together to welcome Andrew Milroy, Principal Advisor, Ecosystem.
I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person in Bangalore. I would love to have been able to attend. Instead, I'm presenting to you from my mother's house in Oxford in the UK, which I have to say is a first for me. My name is Andrew Milroy, and I am Principal Advisor at Ecosystem. And I really am delighted to be able to talk with you today about modernising cybersecurity to address API vulnerabilities. So when we talk about API vulnerabilities, we're talking about application programming interfaces. We're talking about vulnerabilities around the ability of different applications and systems to talk to each other and to share data with one another. What we found is that as the world has gone increasingly digital, there are way more APIs out there. As we start integrating more applications, we start doing things like digitizing our supply chains, encouraging our customers and other stakeholders to engage with us digitally to a much greater extent than before. And of course, this was very rapidly accelerated during the pandemic. But this does create significant vulnerabilities, which I would like to talk to you about today. What I'll do is I'll just start with some high-level data we have about India, some ecosystem data that I can start sharing with you. So, as is common in a lot of our surveys that we do, we found that the primary security concern among respondents in India is application vulnerabilities. We find that despite this, and this is again common in a lot of parts of the world, but it's actually quite pronounced in India, is that only 27% of the folks are evolving cybersecurity strategy and measures in 2023. And it's very difficult to give you an exact explanation for this, but a lot of companies are really tightening their belts. They're starting to go back to basics with cybersecurity. They're starting to do things like assess the risks they have, make sure they have the right policies and processes in place, and just make sure everything is really configured properly. Because I think what a lot of companies have found is that despite spending huge amounts on cybersecurity, they've still succumbed to some very significant breaches. So I think there's a kind of stepping back that we're seeing in the cybersecurity world really to evaluate postures and just make sure that the basics are in place. So we found also in India that only 16% are spending more on cyber solutions in 2023 compared to 2022. So this is, again, in line with this view that companies are really looking to step back and assess the situation that they're in and make tweaks and adjustments to what they've already invested in. Again, just to make sure that the basics are in place, rather than just going out and buying more and more and more without necessarily having the correct policies in place. So let's move on to the major theme today. I mean, there are a lot of aspects we can talk about relating to cyber security, a lot of different issues we can touch upon. But one of the big ones that's getting more and more prominence is related to attacks that come about as a result of API vulnerabilities. So what is this really about? Well, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, that as we basically go more digital, any digital technology really creates a bigger attack surface and more opportunities for malicious actors. What we find with APIs is, as I mentioned, as we have more digital supply chains, more digital interaction with all of our stakeholders, more applications integrating with each other, sharing data, talking to each other, and so forth. This is effectively really expanding the attack surface and just creating way more opportunities for those attackers to seize upon. And what we often find is that APIs are really being put in place very rapidly to get things up and running. And like with a lot of technology when it's rolled out, security is sometimes a bit of an afterthought. So why are we getting this expanded attack surface as a result of the increased use of APIs? Well, We have digital supply chains increasingly, more use of APIs to support that, social engineering as a gateway, cloud misconfiguration. So again, what I mean by this is, as we roll out more clouds and obviously more APIs as well, very often there are issues around configuration. This actually can relate to API setup, but very often just to how clouds are configured. Digital transformation, this is also, as I mentioned, digital transformation, something we talk about a lot, but it's actually the enemy of cybersecurity professionals in many ways, because the more digital transformation we have, the more opportunities there are for attackers. So sure, technology is great for innovation, efficiency, optimizing what we're doing, transforming the way businesses operate, but this transformation also creates way more opportunities for malicious actors. Obviously, folks working remotely and at home as well, this has given more opportunities to the bad guys and expanded the attack surface. We talked a bit about cloud misconfiguration, but these heterogeneous hybrid cloud environments where there are multiple clouds, multi-cloud setups, and private clouds and on-premise capabilities all working together creates this kind of uneven and often poorly configured and poorly integrated opportunity for attackers, expanding the attack surface further. And of course, as we go to look at ways in which we digitize the physical world using IoT or Internet of Things technology, this is creating yet more great opportunities for the bad guys. So in the physical world, critical infrastructure now, critical infrastructure protection is becoming a big issue, and IoT that's used in that, and Industry 4.0 and so on that we talk about a lot, we have been for many years, creates lots of opportunities. So all of these pieces together in this slide, the increased use of APIs, expands attack surfaces, all of them coming together, basically what they effectively do is they expand attack surfaces. So moving on to the next slide, we'll look at some key API vulnerabilities that we've seen from some recent attacks that have taken place. So one of the big ones is access and authorization issues. So the APIs are not set up in a way that controls access to that API and ensures that only authorized folks can actually use them, and they're only able to be used in an authorized way. So that is certainly a big issue. Unauthorized APIs are certainly a big vulnerability, and sometimes in a rush to get the API out and get things working, these authorization and access issues are overlooked. So there's something that really they're often the primary vulnerability around APIs. Another one is insufficient restrictions on requests. Things like rate limiting. Again, this is jargon that's often used in the API world, but fundamentally what we're talking about is being able to pick up if huge amounts of requests are hitting a particular API, an unusually large amount, and unusually large amounts of data are coming from that API as a result of requests to that API. So this is something that we need to control and have controls in place that can monitor the amount of data coming in and out over a particular period of time, maybe context-based controls as well, and so forth. The other one that we often talk about is improper API asset management. And what do we mean by that? Well, that's just often not having full visibility, awareness, and control of all the APIs that the enterprise is using. So that's certainly a big one that needs some focus. And a really big one is excessive API data exposure. So that is, in line with a lot of what we say about cybersecurity, we need to be moving to a world where we minimize the amount of data that we hold and is available and can be accessed by attackers if a breach occurs. We're moving to this world where we assume breaches, so the more data we hold, the more risk we are taking, and that same rule applies to APIs, so we need to ensure that if someone does actually manage to get unauthorized access to an API, there is a limit to the amount of data they can get access to. So we have to control how much data is there. So excessive data exposure is another major API vulnerability that needs serious attention. So let's look at an example API attack chain. So this is actually a very famous attack that took place recently in an Asia Pacific country. Look, in these situations, we don't name the company that was attacked, or even the country for that matter. It might become too obvious who we are talking about. But when we talk about this example API attack chain, it just gives you an idea of the kind of attacks that can take place. So basically what happened is an attacker managed to identify an API with no authentication requirements. So probably that attacker was, looking at multiple APIs, was scanning the API environment for an API that was easy for them to access. And this is, something that is increasingly common in the cybersecurity world. So once they did manage to do this, they found one with no authentication requirement. Now, why was there one with no authentication requirement? Well, in this case, the word on the street, the view of what happened here is it was just simply a developer oversight. And very often the developer will think, well, hey, maybe it's not as important at the API level, because at the application levels or beneath that API, when people enter systems and networks, there will be controls around access and authentication, deeper than the API itself. So often it's just something it's just a mistake, right? It's an insider oversight, a developer oversight that most probably occurred in this particular instance. So what is the attacker then able to do? So what is their step? They've identified this API with no authentication requirement. Then they request millions of records by changing an ID number incrementally. And again, that's a security flaw. It shouldn't be possible to change ID numbers incrementally, but often it is possible to do that, because it should be jumbled, it should be mixed, it shouldn't be that straightforward. But the attacker got lucky. They got in. They found out that they were able to just incrementally add to a number and just get millions and millions and millions of records, from this non-authenticated API. And again, as we talked about earlier with the vulnerability, the data exposure level here was far too great, right? So there was an issue with access and authorization controls. There was far too much data easily available. Also rate limiting, right? So also they were not controlling the number of requests, so the amount of data that was being accessed through that API. So look, there were multiple issues around what could have been done in hindsight with this attack, and it's worth noting that this particular organization, is a huge spender on cybersecurity, and when this happened, it was a major shock. Some of you might have figured out the company we're talking about, but it's an Asia Pacific one. And then step 3, so what did the attackers do? Once they'd managed to exfiltrate these records, they started to demand a ransom. And again, there's a big debate in this country in question, not only this country and others, but whether or not ransoms should be paid. In this case, there was certainly hesitancy, and it is thought that no ransom was paid, and lots of the data was leaked onto the dark web progressively. So look, this is just an example of an API attack chain, and just gives you an idea of the kind of approach that these attackers can take. So moving on to the next slide, what are some of the key lessons that we can take from a range of API attacks? Not just the example I've given you, but a range. So identity and access management needs more focus, particularly privileged access, because often if you manage to get access to something and you've got privileged credentials, you've got the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. So often the CEO or the heads of IT or certain senior people in organizations have far too much access. And it's not because necessarily you don't trust them as individuals, although you do have to be careful, but it's not because you don't trust them as individuals necessarily. It's more because if someone can get access to their credentials, or any of you're creating a huge risk for yourself, right? They get access to those credentials, they can get pretty much everything sometimes. Increased API monitoring and visibility, so just knowing what APIs you have out there, monitoring them, noticing what traffic's coming to and from. Greater focus on encryption, particularly around API requests and responses. So these are some of the key lessons from the attacks that are often overlooked. Storage and purpose limitations, so this is data exposure, so don't hold data that you do not need, right? Only hold data that you absolutely need, and share only necessary information with relevant people who are authorized to access it. And finally, look, rehearse your incident response plans and conduct regular security tests by thoroughly testing those APIs for vulnerabilities. And again, you know, in the day-to-day, you know, I know that a lot of this stuff is easier said than done. Day-to-day, companies are trying to get by, you know, focus on their business, and often these things are somewhat overlooked and difficult to manage because the environment's changing all the time. But these are things that certainly need a lot more focus. So what are the key takeaways to finish off? I know that I'm coming to the end of the session, that the time I was given for this particular session, but you know, key takeaways is that traditional preventative cybersecurity controls are no longer sufficient. When I say preventive controls, a lot of focus has been put in just firewalls and stopping breaches from happening at all. We know that there's no way you can be 100% sure that breaches won't happen. There will be some, so you need controls in place so when someone does get in, there's a limit to the data they can have and a limit to the damage that they can do. Increased use of APIs, major focus of this presentation, is expanding attack surfaces and creating way more opportunities for cyber criminals. And access and authorization issues are the top API vulnerabilities. They're just not. The access and authorization issues around them have not been managed effectively enough, or they haven't really been implemented. Whatever the policy around those issues hasn't been implemented properly. And visibility and monitoring of all APIs is required. Again, this sounds obvious, but it is often simply not done. And perhaps the last and most important thing to do, and is in line with this issue around companies, you know, not wanting to invest huge amounts in new types of technology, is, you know, step back, assess your API risks. Get a handle on what do you actually have out there and what are the risks associated with those APIs. So view it as, you know, part of your overall cybersecurity discipline is to go, okay, so, you know, all these new APIs have been rolled out and pushed out, you know, where are they, what have they been used for, what are the policies around each of them, have we got an inventory of them, let's assess the risk associated with them. So these are the key takeaways around some of these API vulnerabilities. So on that note, thank you so much for your attention today. I hope you guys are having a great time in Bangalore and the day is going very well. And once again, greetings from England. So I hope I have a chance to meet you face to face sometime soon. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Andrew. That was Andrew Milroy, Principal Advisor, Ecosystem.